This video is not about answering a question. It's about asking one. And to be honest, the question may not even be a good one. But as a writer of books, comic books, graphic novels, link in the description, this one's free to read, and video scripts for a small but growing YouTube channel, everything I write has tried to ask questions rather than having any answers. So for example, when people leave comments in my videos pointing out the innumerable ways in which I got something wrong, my natural response is usually one of gratitude for viewers taking the time to offer their perspective or opinion, even if that opinion is to point out how mine might be wrong. So without delaying any further, the question I wanted to ask today is this: what happened to the golden age of indie gaming? Before properly examining this question, let's start with credentials, because the funny thing about video game knowledge is that it's all relative. When I was a kid, I played a ton of Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 down at my local arcade. I was better than any siblings, better than my friends, better than complete strangers, better than anyone that dared to put a quarter up against me. Or at least I was, until I heard about a UMK3 tournament at the mall one town over. Because that is where I quickly learned that not only was I not the best UMK3 player, I wasn't even close to being good. I got bounced in the quarterfinals by someone using Nightwolf, and I don't think I'd ever seen anyone fight with him before. Now imagine, if you will, a planet, and let's call this planet Planet Gamer, with each layer representing how into video games a person is. At its core are the most hardcore gamers you can possibly imagine. People whose lives are completely enveloped by video games, to the point that almost nothing happens in the world of gaming without their knowledge. I'm not passing judgment on those sorts of people, plenty of others do. I'm merely using them as the apex for this metaphor. The further you get away from the core are gamers who are increasingly not as hardcore as the hardcore core. The most outer layer representing your grandmother who knows who Mario and Sonic are. I am somewhere in one of those layers. Nowhere near your grandmother, but probably closer to her than the core. I've been playing video games for roughly 30 years, but I'm also willing to concede that most people know more about them than I do. So if you disagree with the case I'm about to advance, there's a good chance you may be right. I'm just a guy sitting here asking questions. The history of art, like the history of anything, including history itself, is a story. A series of events that happen and are recorded and organized in the order in which they happen. But the story of art, instead of being told in chapters or acts, is told in movements. There was Impressionism, followed by Post-Impressionism, followed by Expressionism, and so on. But these labels are usually applied well after they actually occur. Artists during the Renaissance, or Renaissance if you're British, weren't walking around saying, "Gee, we sure are making some Renaissance art, aren't we?" And video games, despite their relatively recent history, are already thought of by many in these terms. There is the 8-bit era, the 16-bit era, and so on. Many of the early video game movements are considered for their processing limitations. But as gaming technology has expanded, I think we are less likely to consider gaming using those terms. Which got me thinking about how the past few decades or so of gaming are defined by and what they could be classified as. I thought about trends from recent years and even decades, what worked, what didn't, what I'd like to see a return of, and so on. And it dawned on me that, in my relatively casual gamer opinion, one of my favorite eras had seemingly passed me by without my even noticing it. Now, the thing about artistic movements that's interesting is how they are oftentimes considered as a response to what came before them. The age of realism, which focused on strikingly realistic portrayals of the subject, was followed by Impressionism, which focused on portraying the impressions that the subject made on the artist. So before we can define what I'm calling the golden age of indie games, we must first look at what I believe it was a response to. The age before the golden age, or what I'm calling the age of quote-unquote important games. Now this is going to be a monumental case of the pot calling the kettle black, but this era of gaming can, in my opinion, be defined by the statement, games are art. Namely, the critics and journalists who, at least according to the accusations made by many at the time, migrated to video games because they weren't qualified or well connected enough to work in a more prestigious field. Now, whether or not any of that is true is a Gamergate beehive I'd rather not kick. So if you want to have that discussion in the comments, have at it. But what is certainly undeniable is that the indie games that became popular during this era Well, let's just say they lacked both the longevity and cultural staying power that many of their most ardent supporters in video games journalism would have hoped. Games like Braid, Fez, Depression Quest, Gone Home, Papers, Please, and The Vanishing of Ethan Carter received considerable acclaim from several gaming outlets. Not because they were fun or memorable, but because they were quote-unquote important. And more than 10 years on, in addition to not a single one of them spawning a sequel, they have had almost no cultural impact, and many of their developers have gotten out of the games industry entirely, becoming either journalists themselves or returning to more traditional art forms. It's almost as if whether or not a game is important should be decided by the audience of gamers and not a cabal of wannabe arts and culture critics. But I digress. So in 2014, following about a half-decade of having super-duper important artsy-fartsy video games being shoveled in our faces, to the acclaim of gaming's aristocracy and indifference among gamers, the landscape of indie games looked primed for a... Now again, I'm not a game developer. I'm not even a hardcore gamer. I'm just a normie, somewhere in the layers of Planet Gamer. Meaning that when a game releases, I usually don't know about it until enough hardcore gamers praise it to the point that the signals of its greatness reaches my position, through a process of cultural osmosis. But from my perspective, at some point in the year 2014, indie games suddenly got very, very good very, very quickly. Games like Shovel Knight, Enter the Gungeon, The Binding of Isaac Rebirth, not the vanilla Flash game, Cuphead, games that had depth and weight like Undertale, Ori and the Blind Forest, and Subnautica. Hell, even Five Nights at Freddy's. Man, as weird as that fandom is, I'm not ashamed to admit I played a ton of FNAF 2, and you know what? It was fun as hell, boy. But after years of artsy junk trying to, quote, redefine what it means to be a video game, it seemed like gamers had finally risen up to reclaim what should have always been theirs. But then 2019 hit and... This is the part of the video where I might lose you. Thus far, I don't think I've said anything too disagreeable. The early 2010s had a bunch of art house crap that no one cared about. The mid-2010s had a bunch of fun as hell, awesome games that players have been clamoring for more of ever since. Where the hell is Silksong, Team Cherry? But at some point, around 2019-ish, the party, at least to me, seemed to be over.
I'm afraid that I don't hear a thing. Just silence.
Now, does that mean that really good indie games stopped being released? No. Does it mean the games you played that were released after 2019 are garbage? Also no. What I'm saying is that from my position on the outskirts of Planet Gamer, the signals stopped coming. And furthermore, I don't see the signs that these games are having an impact on the culture. When I watch gaming-related content on YouTube, I oftentimes hear songs from indie game soundtracks being used in the background. Know what I hear? Undertale, Shovel Knight, Hollow Knight, and Celeste. All games that were released during my previously defined Golden Age. To put it succinctly, at a certain point I stopped feeling the cultural impact of any indie games. Even a basic Google search returns a bunch of games from the 2010s, and not much else. Hades? Fall Guys? I think I remember people talking about them briefly. So with regards to the question that opened this video, what happened to indie gaming's golden age? Well, what happened? What changed? Do any of you know? Would you care to elucidate for me in the comments? And I can do a follow-up video showcasing your answers? Or am I just full of crap? Am I the one who's changed? If so, that means that there's a ton of great post-2019 indie games I'm missing out on due to sheer ignorance. If that's the case, let me know which ones in the comments, and maybe I can start getting caught up on them and talking about them. But either way, thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing your responses.